In this part of our tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to use Passport.js to integrate authentication for your Express application. We're going to be using a local strategy for Passport, which just means that instead of using a third-party provider like Google, Facebook, Twitter, we're actually going to be using credentials that are saved on the actual application's database. In our case, we don't have a database, so it'll be saved in an array. But the idea is for local authentication, the application saves that information compared to using just a third-party provider to log into their application. I'll show you how to use local authentication, and then in later parts of the tutorial, I'll show you how to use OAuth 2 so that you can learn how to integrate third-party providers to log into your application using something like Discord or GitHub or Twitter. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that we're going to do is install Passport. So I'll type npm i passport. And since we're using a local strategy, we need to make sure we install the correct strategy package. So aside from Passport, we need to also install passport-local. Again, if you were using, let's say, Facebook as the way to authenticate users to your platform, then you would have to install passport-facebook as the strategy. And all it is it's just a package that you install with Passport. So let's go ahead and hit enter, and this will install the packages for us. And let me just go ahead and run my server. And now we'll go ahead and configure everything in our application. So what I need to do is I first need to import Passport. So import Passport from Passport. Now, Passport integrates really well with Express Session, and many times you will actually use Express Session with Passport or vice versa, Passport with Express Session. You don't need Express Session with Passport, but it is highly recommended, and many people do in fact use both of them together because Passport will take care of mapping that user that was just logging in with the session ID. If you need to recap on sessions, check out the previous section of the tutorial where I actually showed you multiple examples of how to use Express Session. So what I'm going to do after importing Passport is I'm going to enable it. So where I am registering the session middleware, which is right over here, I want to make sure I am registering Passport after I enable the session middleware because that needs to be done before. And then we also need to make sure we enable Passport before we register our routes. So in between the session middleware being registered and where we are registering our routes, I'm going to go ahead and call app.use, and I'm going to reference Passport and call the initialize method just like that. Okay. And then since we are using sessions, I'm going to call app.use again and pass passport.session. Primarily, this will take care of actually attaching a dynamic user property to the request object called user. And then you can actually access that user object by simply just referencing it from the user or from the request object. And then you can know who the actual user is that is making the request. I'll show you how that works later on. So that's all we need to do inside our index.mjs file. So next thing I will do is I'm going to go into my source folder. I'll create a new folder and I'll call it strategies. So this is where I will have all of my strategies. So right now we currently will only have a local strategy. So I'll create a file called localstrategy.mjs. And what I'm going to do is import Passport. Let me zoom in a little bit. So import Passport from Passport. And then we want to import this strategy class, and it comes from the Passport local package. Now, all of the strategies will have this strategy class. So if you installed the Passport Facebook package, it would have its own strategy class. I just wanted to mention that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call passport.use. And this is where we tell Passport to actually use our strategy. Okay, so we need to pass in an instance of this local strategy right over here, of this strategy class. So I just need to simply create a new instance. So new strategy like this. Now the strategy constructor can take in actually two arguments. I don't know if you saw right over here. You can pass in options or you can pass in this verify function. For now, I'm going to just ignore the options because you won't really need this. And later on in the video, I'll explain when you'll actually need this options. But I'm just going to specify this verify function. So that's just going to be this callback function right over here. And this callback function takes in three arguments. It takes in the username, password, and then it takes in this done function. Now, since my application takes in a username and a password, this works perfectly. The way that these arguments get passed to this callback function is whenever you make a post request to your endpoint that takes care of handling authentication, Passport will look for the username and the password inside the request body that was sent to that post request endpoint. And then it will pass it in as arguments to this callback function. So this is assuming that we do in fact use a username to authenticate. Now, sometimes you might not use a username. You might use something like an email, or maybe the username might be named differently. So that is where you actually need to pass in this options right over here, because you need to tell Passport that we're actually not using a username field, but we're using, let's say, the email address field. So what you would do is you would specify this username field, and then you'll tell Passport, okay, the actual username field is the email field, like that. Then Passport will look for the email field in the request body and then send that as the argument for username. So I just wanted to mention that. I'm going to leave this out for now, and then once we finish implementing this strategy, I'll show you how it actually works. So what we'll do is inside here, this verify function, think of it like this. This is the function that is responsible for doing a couple things, but the main thing is to validate the user. So you need to make sure that the user actually exists, and then you need to check to see if the passwords are the same, the password that we sent to the server, and then the password that was attached to the user object itself from the database, or in our case, an array. So those are the two main checks. Of course, there might be additional checks that you would want to perform, but generally those are the two major ones. So again, the first thing that we need to do is search for the actual user. Right now, I don't have a database set up, but if for some reason you might have one already configured, then what you need to do is just use whatever database module you're using to interact with the database, search for the user by the username in this case, find the user, and then once you find the user, check the passwords. So let's do that. So I'll go ahead and declare a variable called find user, and I'm going to import that mock users array. So this array just has a bunch of users right over here with a username, ID, display name, and password. And I'm going to use the find method to search for the user by the username. So user.username is equal to username. Okay. So this will search for the user by the username. If the user is not found, then we actually want to throw an error. But before we throw any errors, let me actually wrap all of this inside a try catch. Just like this. So that way, now when I throw my error right over here, and I'll say for the message, user not found, that error will be caught inside this catch right over here. Okay? Now let me go ahead and do this. If the user is not found, we'll throw an error. I'll handle the error case in just a bit, but I want to move on. So let's say if the user is found, we want to check the password. So if find user.password is not equal to the password that was sent to the server, then we're going to throw another error. We'll just say user or password, I'll say invalid credentials. Okay? Okay, so now let's handle the errors that could be thrown. So we're going to catch those errors inside this catch block right over here. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and call this done function when we handle the error. So notice how this done function, it takes in two arguments. It takes in an error, and it also takes in a user, which could be a falsy value. So of course, when an error happens, that means the user itself was not validated correctly. Okay, so that could be either the user was not found or the passwords did not match. So in this case, we want to make sure we do pass in that error object. And for the user, we can just pass in null like that. And then this will just pretty much move on from this verify function into the next step, which we will get into. Okay, so that's what we have to do for the catch. Of course, when we are done validating the user, if both of these cases are false, so if the user actually is found and the passwords are actually correct, they do actually match, then we want to make sure we also call the done function. But this time, there are no errors, so we'll pass in null. And then for the user, we'll pass in the user that we found, like this. And that's it for the verify function. Okay? So, like I said, for the database, you would query the database, find the user, check the password, if the user exists, of course. And then any errors that could be thrown would be caught inside this catch block right over here. Hence why we're using try and catch. And then if everything is good, you'll call the done function, pass in null for the error because there were no errors, and then pass in that user instance. Any errors would be caught with this catch block, and then you would call done, pass in that error instance, and then Passport would take care of handling that error for us. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually register our middleware, our Passport middleware, because right now all this does is it validates the user, but there's still a whole bunch of things that we have to do, especially since we are using Passport with Express Session. Okay, so we need to import this local strategy file into our index file, but first let's actually export this passport.use call. So I'm going to export default passport.use, and I'll import it right over here like this. So import and then the path to the file. So this will literally import this whole thing right over here into our index file. Okay. And then now we need to set up an endpoint that we can actually use as our authentication endpoint, where users will make a request to, or the HTTP client will make a request to. It will pass in the username and password in the request body. And then that endpoint will take care of invoking our Passport middleware. So it'll actually invoke this verify function. Let me just quickly log out the username and password. Let me just do this. Username. And let me do the same thing for password, so that you all can actually see what's happening underneath the hood. Okay. So let's go ahead and set up our endpoint. I'll just do this inside the index.mjs file, just to keep everything simple. If you've been following along the entire series, I recommend you put everything in its own router. But let's go inside our index file and let's set up, let's do this app.post. So the path will be /API/auth. And then we need to pass in passport.authenticate like this. And we're going to call the function like that. And then we want to also pass in our final request handler. So let's do that, request and response. And then let's go ahead inside this authenticate function call. We need to specify what strategy we want to use. And it's literally just going to be the name of our strategy. In our case, the strategy for local is just local. So we're just going to pass in local like this. Okay, that's literally all we have to do. Of course, if you're using Discord strategy, you would pass in Discord. For GitHub, you would pass in GitHub. For Google, you would pass in Google like that, and vice versa. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a request to /API/auth, making a post request to it. And you'll see how it's going to go ahead and invoke this passport.authenticate middleware function. And then it'll call this verify function. So let's do that. Let me go to Thunder client. Let's do this. Okay, so post request to our API/auth endpoint that we just set up. Click send. Okay, so ignore this error for now. I'll address that in just a bit. But let's take a look at the console and let's see what's going on. You can see right over here, username and password are being logged. So that verifies that we are actually inside this callback function. So Passport actually called this callback function right over here. And then all of this logic is being performed. Okay, so it's going to go ahead and search for the user. If the user is not found, it'll throw a user not found error. So let me type in a username that doesn't exist in our array. So when I pass in this username Anson, you see how it says user not found. That's the error that I manually thrown over here. And then it gets caught right over here, and then it calls the done function. Okay. Notice how if I actually don't even pass in, if I pass in a null value for error, we actually won't even get an error. This is a completely different error. I'm not sure why it says 4.1 unauthorized. But yeah, see, it doesn't throw that error, but it gives us that instead. Okay. But of course, let me pass the error back. Click send and pass in the invalid username. It will say user not found. Let's say if the user is found, but the credentials are invalid. And so I'm going to pass in the wrong password. It'll say invalid credentials. So before I move on, let me just show you real quick about the username field that I mentioned earlier. So let's say, for example, you are expecting the user to provide the email address as their username. So let's say that We have email. Let's just do anson@gmail.com as an example. So watch this. What we need to do is we need to pass in that options right over here. And then we need to pass in this username field and just specify the field that's going to be our username, which in this case is going to be email. And if I click send, you'll see now I can actually use the email field as my username. And if you look at the logs, let's show you right over here. Okay, right over here, username anson@gmail.com. Okay, you can of course you can change up the arguments, so change the email like that if you want to. So hopefully that makes sense, and that shows you how you can use the username field. If let's say the username field was something else, let's say if it was something like user_name for whatever reason, then you could just specify that. Okay, and of course if I try to send this will no longer work. If I try to use username like this, that will not work. I have to explicitly say user_name, so that way Passport knows which field to look for. So I hope that part makes sense. Okay, let me just remove this part. Okay, so now the other thing that I wanted to talk about was this error that I just encountered. So you see how it says failed to serialize user into session? So here's the thing. We actually successfully were able to authenticate by checking all these credentials and verifying that it was correct. But because Passport needs to actually serialize the user into the session, we need to actually implement two functions, okay? Because right now we don't have those functions implemented. That is why we are getting this error. So what we need to do is inside our strategy file, I'm going to go ahead and reference Passport, and I'm going to go ahead and look for this serialize user function. So I'm going to call that. And this function takes in an argument, which is a callback function like this. And this callback function takes in two arguments. This first argument is going to be the actual user that we are trying to serialize, okay? So first of all, what exactly does this function do? Well, this function is responsible for actually taking that user object that we just validated and then storing it in the session, okay? And that's the reason why I mentioned earlier that Passport integrates very well with Express Session. So it takes that user that we just found from this verify function, and it'll take care of storing it in the session data, okay? The second argument is going to be this done function. So inside this serialize user function, you don't really need to do anything, but just call this done function. And it takes in two arguments. It takes in an error. In this case, we're not really doing anything, so we just pass a null for the error. And you'll notice that right over here, the suggested name for the field, it says ID. You can actually pass in whatever you want for this second argument that relates to the user. So for example, I can just pass in user like this. Okay. Now, depending on what you pass in to this second argument, actually ends up being the argument that will be passed into a callback function for this deserialize user function. Don't worry about that right now. I'm going to implement it in just a second. But what I want to do instead of passing just the user object, I want to pass in the ID of the user like this. You want to pass in something that is unique. Okay, so either the ID or a username, something that is unique that can be used to search for the user either in our array or a database. Okay, so now let's move on to the next function that we need to implement. So deserialize user is the next function. And this also takes in a callback function. And this callback function takes in two arguments. It takes in whatever it was that you passed in to the done function for serialize user. So notice how I pass in the ID. So this actually gets passed into this callback function for deserialize user. Okay, and let me actually show you this Stack Overflow post, because I think this post is very helpful for a lot of people. So I want to show it to you all. So right over here, they kind of give you like an explanation to how all this stuff works. But I want you to pay attention over here. The user was able to provide a visual flow. So you can see over here, we have both our serialize and deserialize user functions. So whatever they pass into that done function for serialize user, that pretty much gets saved to the session. Okay, and I'll show you later how that looks like as an object. But it gets saved and it gets passed right over here Okay, well, it doesn't really get passed per se. It's just that the deserialized user will use the ID to actually search for the user inside that function that we're going to implement. Okay, if we were to pass in the username, then it would look up the username in the session data, and it would use that to search for the user in the database. Okay, but I just wanted to show you this very quickly because I think this is extremely helpful for a lot of people instead of just not mentioning it at all. So the second argument for the callback function for deserialized user will be the done function as well. But this time inside deserialized user, we actually need to search for the user itself. Now again, serialized user is to tell Passport how to serialize that user data into the session. So in other words, it's going to store that user ID into the session data. Okay? And that's really all you need. Deserialized user is how we can take that ID and kind of like unpack, reveal who the actual user is. And then what happens is it takes that user object that we were able to retrieve via the ID, and it stores that user object into the request object itself. Okay, so later on, you'll see how we can reference request.user when we make requests. But what we need to do inside deserialized user is search for the user either in our database or in our array. So what I'll do is let me use a try catch. And first I'll search for the user. So const find user equals mock users. And I'm going to search by the ID this time. So user ID is equal to ID. If the user is not found, I'll throw an error. And we'll catch the error inside this catch block right over here. And then we'll call the done function and we'll pass in an error. We'll pass in the error that we caught. And then we'll pass in null for the user because the user was not found. And then if the user is found, we will call done, pass in null for the error, and then pass in the user instance like this. Okay, so again, we're searching for the user. If it's found, then we will call done, and then Passport will take care of taking this user object and attaching it to the request object itself. If the user is not found, then it will just call the done function inside this catch block with the error, and then Passport will handle the error for us. Okay, so now let me go ahead and write some logs real quick. Because I really want to show you all how this all works, and I want to show you the order of operations. Okay, because it's very important. It's one thing to actually write the code, but it's another thing to actually understand how this all works. Because when I first was trying to understand all this, I didn't know anything about this at all until I really dug deep into researching how all this stuff works. Okay, so let me write some logs. Okay. Okay. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's make a post request to /API/auth. So notice how right now it's still processing the request. It's not going to send a response back. Don't worry about that yet. But let me just show you what happens right over here. Let me go down over here. Restart. Whoops, let me just restart my server. You kind of saw the logs up there, but let me just resend the request. Okay. So you can see right over here, first, we're inside the verify function because that's where we are logging the username and password. And then after everything is successful, okay, because we did pass in the correct credentials, you can see how we're inside serialized user and it logs that user object right over here. Okay, so then you'll notice that nothing else happens. Don't worry. The reason why nothing happens currently is because after we call serialized user, what happens is it's going to go ahead and call this next middleware function, which is going to be our request handler function. So we aren't doing anything inside here. So why don't we actually just send a response back? Okay, and let's try this again. Okay, so we're good. And everything is good. Whoops, let me do send status. Sorry about that. Send status. Okay. Okay, so everything is good. What's going on here? User is not defined. Seems like we got an error. Okay, don't worry about that. I will have to address that. Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. Let me fix this real quick. I passed in user instead of find user. Let me fix that. I apologize. Hopefully you all caught the error yourself very quickly. Okay, so let me do this again. So first, I'm going to click send. Good. And that error just happened earlier because when I made a second request, it actually tried to call the deserialized user function. So I'll explain that. So the first thing that happens is when we first log in, we call serialized user once. That's all we need to do is call it once. This function, this callback function, needs to be called when we log in. And we're only going to log in one time, obviously, until we log out and then re-log back in. Okay? Once we have logged in, any request that we make later on, what happens is Passport will then call the callback function for deserialized user. So this callback function is going to get called if I make another request. Okay, so let's see what happens. I'm going to click send. See how now, let's see. Okay, yeah, right over here. See how right now it's going to go ahead and call deserialize user inside deserializer. And it says deserializing user ID of 1. Okay. And again, it's calling a serialized user because we're actually trying to call the login endpoint. But you'll notice that if I try to call another endpoint, it's not going to call serialized user. Okay, but you can see the order of how things are working. Let me go ahead and implement another endpoint. Let me do this. Let me implement app.get/API/auth. Let's implement a status endpoint. And this endpoint is responsible for checking to see if the user is authenticated or not. Okay, so remember how earlier I said that the user object will be attached to the request object? So if I were to console log request.user, and let me just go ahead and write inside, because we have a bunch of logs everywhere, so I want to label everything. And then what I'll do is this. So I'm not going to send a response back. I'll just log this right now. Okay. So let's redo everything. Let's log in. So let's go ahead and call this endpoint. So it goes ahead and we log in. It calls serialized user. And then inside serialized user, we log the user. That's fine. Now let's make a get request. So let me hit new request. Okay, I'm going to make a get request to that new endpoint /auth/status. And now inside this status endpoint, we want to make sure that we are only sending a response back, the user response back, if the user object actually exists on the request object. And that's a good indicator to let you know if the user is authenticated or not. So if request.user, I'll return a response with the user object. And of course, if the user is not defined, if this property is not defined, and there's no value, then we'll just simply return response. Let's do send status 401. And let me actually just quickly use it. I'm going to use a ternary operator instead. Return request.user. So let me just copy that. And then response send status 401. So now I can remove this. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Oh, whoops, sorry about that. Okay, should have been colon. So this is a ternary operator right over here. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's log in right now. So I'm going to make a post request to my authentication endpoint. Click send. Okay, we're good. Now let's go ahead and make a get request to the status endpoint. Let's see, user is not defined. I might have an error somewhere else. What's going on over here? Oh, whoops, I forgot. It's not user, it's request.user. Okay, let's relog in. So you'll see that when I log in, we are inside serialized user, so that gets called, that's fine. So now we don't need to log in anymore because we've already logged in one time. So we should be logged in. So if I click this right over here, you can see that I can access my user reference because I'm logged in as Anson. And notice how when I make a request to this endpoint, it's going to go ahead and call the deserialize user function. You can see the logs are right over here. And again, what happens is the deserialize user function will use that ID from the session store. Okay, because that's where the data is really being saved inside the session store and also the session object itself. And then it will use that to search for the user. In this case, we're only saving the ID. Let me also show you one more thing that was also mentioned in that Stack Overflow post as well. let me console log rec.session. And let me just do this. Oh, whoops, sorry about that. It's request.session. Yep. Okay. All right, so let me do this again. And let me go down here. Okay, you notice how right over here, and the reason why I'm showing this, because again, I want you to understand how all this works. Notice how now the session object has this passport property. And if you saw the part where we talked about express sessions, you'll remember that as soon as you modify the session object, it sets the cookie and sends it to the front end or the client. So if you see right over here, if I look at cookies, I actually have this cookie right over here, and this is my session ID on the server. Okay. So as soon as we modify that session, which Passport is modifying the session for us, so it attaches this Passport object to it, and then notice how it takes this ID and then maps it to the user like that, and that's assigned to the Passport object. And now watch this. If I were to go back to serialize user, and if I were to change this to, let's say, username, so let me do that real quick. So let me change it to username. I'll just remove this log right over here. So let's search by the username. Okay. And now I want you to see what happens. So I'm going to log in right now. Okay. So I've just logged in, and I'm going to make a request to that auth/status endpoint. And now if you look at the logs, you can see that we serialized the user by using that username field. Now, some of you might wonder, well, why can't we just pass in the whole user object? So let's say, for example, instead of just passing in the ID or just the username, I pass in the entire user object right over here. So since we have the user object, I probably don't even need to search for it. So you know what? Let me just comment all this out, and I'll just replace all this for now. I wouldn't recommend this, but I'll just show you what happens. So let's re-log in. And you can see how now passport.user has the entire user record populated. Okay, so let me explain to you why you probably don't want to do this. Because your session data, you don't want it to have a bunch of information that could possibly go stale. Okay, because think of it like this, right? Something like the ID is never going to change. Okay, the username might change every once in a while, but the ID is never going to change. If, let's say, the display name changes and then you deserialize the user by simply grabbing that user from the session data, and then you grab everything, including that stale display name, that's going to be returned back to the client if they request it. Okay, so if you make changes to the database, it's not going to be synced up with your session data. You'll have to manually update that yourself, and that is going to be an additional scope of work that you'll have to take care of. And you also don't want to just store a bunch of properties inside the session data that you don't really need, because it's just going to take up a lot of memory, and you're going to clog up your entire database with all of the stuff that you don't need. All you really need is just some unique identifier such as the ID or the username, and then you're good. You don't need anything else aside from that. Okay, the deserialize user function is responsible for finding that user and then attaching it to that request.user object. That's all it is. Okay, so again, you could do it, but should you? Probably not. All right, so I'm just going to change everything back to using the ID. And then let's go ahead and take a look at this. So I'm going to log in. I'm good here. I can log in as any other user I want. So watch this. Oh, and one more thing I'm going to show you. Notice how if I delete my cookies, and if I try to call this endpoint again, it's going to give me a 401 unauthorized because I don't have that cookie anymore. Okay, which of course makes sense. But let's try to log in as a different user. So let's log in as Adam. So the password is hello, hello. So I am logged in as Adam. Okay, so now if I make a GET request to the status endpoint, my credentials will be Adam Adams. So now you'll see in the logs that this is what we have. Okay, so I hope all this makes sense, and I hope you better understand how to use Passport now. And what I'll do in the next part of our tutorial is we're going to go ahead and actually set up a database, and then you're going to learn how to use the database to create the user and also save the user to the database. And then we have a full-on login, logout mechanism. Before I end this part of the tutorial though, I do want to show you one more thing on how to log the user out. In other words, just destroy the session. Okay, so what I'll do is right over here. So I'm going to set up an endpoint. It'll be a post request. So app.post/API/auth/logout. And let's pass in our callback function. And then first, let's just check to see if there is no user defined, which means the user is not actually logged in. Then I'll return a response and I'll send a status of 401, which means not authenticated. And then if they are logged in, we'll just reference the request object, and then we can just call this logout function. And then we do need to pass in a callback function for this. Okay. And then all I'll do is this. If there's any error, I'll just return response, send status 400, I guess. And I think that's really all we need to do. But if there's no errors, I'll just send a response back of 200. Okay, let's test this out now. So let's log in. And then let's see our status. So we are logged in. Let me go ahead and make a new request. So it's a post request. So /API/auth/logout. And you can see now we are logged out. And okay, so our cookies are still going to be present on our client. But if I try to make a request to the status endpoint, it's going to say 401 unauthorized, because even though we are sending cookies to the server knows that that cookie is not valid. Okay. So even if I try to, well, now if I actually try to send a post request to here, you can see that it gives us a 401 unauthorized because we are not logged in. Okay. So it doesn't matter if we have the cookie, this cookie is no longer valid. So it's going to give us a 401. Okay. So hopefully this makes sense. And in the next part of this whole tutorial series, I'm going to actually set up a database, and then we'll actually convert everything over. And then you'll learn how to actually encrypt the password as well, instead of just comparing raw passwords right now, which is what you don't want to do. So I'll see you in the next part of this tutorial.